glad you could join us this warm afternoon. For those of you who are here for the first time or who aren't very familiar with us, the Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We pride ourselves on teaching the ethical and prudential use of all of the instruments of power, from more hands-on instruments of power like military strategy and public diplomacy, intelligence and counterintelligence. We also study the moral and intellectual dimensions of statecraft, strategy, and conflict. At IWP, we study everything that would lead to a greater understanding of the affairs of state and the affairs of states. It's with an interest in the moral and intellectual dimensions of statecraft that this afternoon's events will revolve. We're very fortunate to have our adjunct professor, Joshua Muravchik, here today to speak about his new book, Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel. Now, Professor Muravchik has taught here at IWP since 1992, I believe. He teaches ideas and values in international politics, one of our most fundamental courses. He's a fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also a former fellow at the George W. Bush Institute, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a scholar in residence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. The Wall Street Journal once said of Professor Muravchik, Josh Muravchik may be the most cogent and careful neoconservative writer on foreign policy. And right, indeed he does. He's published more than 11 books and literally hundreds of articles and scholarly essays. We're very fortunate to have him here with us today, and without further ado, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you all for the reception. Put this somewhere. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Charles said, I have been teaching here in an adjunct capacity for a very long time, so this feels like a very familial environment for me, and I thank you for being here. I got the idea for this book one morning in the shower in 2009. I had already looked at the news that day, or on the internet, and I was riveted by a story that appeared not in the news here, but that I read about on the internet, a story that appeared in Sweden, in the largest circulation Swedish daily newspaper, Aftonbladet. And this story reported that Israelis had taken to slaughtering random Palestinians in order to harvest their body organs for sale. After the story appeared, the Swedish ambassador to Israel issued an apology, and shortly, a few days later, she was forced to retract her apology. She was forced to do that by the Swedish Foreign Ministry, which said that her apology constituted an infringement on freedom of the press. The story, of course, was complete nonsense, and it revolved around a single individual Palestinian who had died at a relatively young age, and who therefore had an autopsy, and therefore whose body had a scar on it from the autopsy, and this was taken to have been a scar from the harvesting of his body organs. But when other reporters went to the town or village where this man lived and spoke to his family, they even denied having told the Swedish correspondent that they thought that there had been this harvesting of organs. So, in short, this Swedish newspaper man made this story up more or less out of whole cloth. But not only had he written it in some length and drama, but his editors saw fit to publish it and to make a splash out of it. When I finished reading that, I kind of slapped my forehead, and I asked myself, how did we get to this point? This is so crazy. It's easy for me to understand that people here, there, wherever disagree with Israeli policy, are critical of settlements, think the Israeli government is being too hard line or not conciliatory enough in negotiations, or to feel critical toward Israeli policy on 100 other points. But how did we get to a point where people, not just nuts on the street, but the journalists and the editors with the largest newspaper in Sweden could think it plausible that Israelis would behave in this fiendish way of making a business out of slaughtering people. I was puzzled by it all the more because I could remember very well a time some decades before when mostly in the world, and certainly in the European world, the prevailing view toward Israel was friendly, even admiring. When the novel Exodus was published, that was in the mid-1950s, and it was a kind of romanticized version of the birth of the State of Israel. It became the biggest bestseller in the United States since Gone with the Wind. And it was then translated into scores of other languages and became a bestseller in many other countries as well. In 1967, the time of the Six-Day War, public opinion polls showed that Americans favored Israel over the Arabs by a very substantial ratio of, as best I recall, something like 5-1. But public opinion polls in England and France showed the people there favoring Israel by even larger margins than in the United States. And even in the United Nations, the Security Council adopted Resolution 242, which essentially gave Israel what it was seeking out of the diplomatic process. And when the Arab states tried to counterbalance that with a different resolution in the General Assembly, they were unable to amass the necessary votes. You compare that to the situation today, I don't think there's anything you can put on a piece of paper vis-a-vis Israel that the general, of a critical sort, that the General Assembly wouldn't pass by overwhelming vote today, usually with only the U.S. and Israel casting no votes. So the question that I set out to answer in researching for this book was, what had happened to bring about this transformation, dramatic transformation? To my knowledge, there's never been a case like it in history in which a country which has not itself undergone a revolution that completely changed its own political makeup experienced such a total reversal in the way the world treated it and looked at it. So the first factor that stared me in the face in asking the question, what brought about this change, was the 1967 war itself. For one thing, Israel was never again to seem so vulnerable and endangered as it did on the eve of that war. Instead of seeming weak, Israel seemed strong. Secondly, there was a large impact on the Soviet Union, which was the backer of the Arabs, who provided their arms and actually had done a lot to goad them into that war. So the war was seen in some extent as a proxy between Israel as a Western allied state and the Arabs as Soviet allied, and therefore having a kind of Cold War drama to it. And the Soviet Union felt very humiliated by Israel's lightning victory. And this humiliation actually had consequences within the Soviet bloc. First of all, it awakened the Jews of the Soviet Union to begin to create a movement demanding the freedom to emigrate from the USSR. This was the first time in the history of Soviet communism that there had been anything approaching a mass movement of protest or opposition. There had, of course, been miscellaneous dissidents before that, but the movement of Soviet Jews was a quite substantial movement and completely unprecedented. It also had an impact within the Soviet bloc, where people who hated being under Soviet rule but had not too much hope. The Soviet Union seemed like such a brick wall of power. Now saw that the Soviets by proxy had been defeated, and therefore did not seem so invulnerable or insurmountable as they had done before the war. And all of this made the Soviet rulers very fearful and angry, and they very drastically accelerated their worldwide campaigns against Zionism as a great evil force in the world. Another factor that came out of the '67 war came from a second humiliation, and that was the humiliation of Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The hot idea in the Arab world in that era, much as Islamism is the hot idea now, but in that era the hot idea was pan-Arabism. And the leading exponent of that idea was Nasser, who was the most popular leader in the history of the Arab world, admired very widely from end to end. He was the main exponent of this idea that all of the Arabs should be gathered into a single state, and he also had a clear idea of who should be the leader of that state. But he was the one who led the Arabs into this war, and he was fantastically humiliated by the defeat in 1967. He even resigned dramatically, and then mass demonstrations in the streets called on him to return to office. Some of those demonstrations may have been spontaneous, and some of them may have been engineered by his security services. We don't know exactly. My guess is that there was a little of each. But even though he returned to office for a few years until he died untimely of a heart attack, his prestige was shattered, and with his prestige went the idea of pan-Arabism, which never regained its luster. And the death of pan-Arabism cleared the way for the renewed expression of nationalism, particular nationalisms within the Arab world, and in particular of the Palestinian nationalism, which had not really existed until that point. When I say it had not existed, I'm of course exaggerating a little bit. There had been individual intellectuals here and there among Palestinian Arabs who had this idea, but it was mostly a quite marginal idea. when the PLO had been formed in 1964, and it was founded, the idea of the Palestine Liberation Organization was not to liberate, it was not the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It was not an expression of Palestinianism. It was the Palestine Liberation Organization, meaning that this territory called Palestine needed to be liberated from the Jews. It was a question of who it would be liberated from, not who it would be liberated for. It would be liberated for, in fact, the Arab nation, not the Palestinian nation. And this was quite clear in the foundational document of the PLO, which is called the Palestinian National Covenant. I should have said first that the founding of the PLO was itself something arranged by Nasser, not by Palestinians. And it was at his behest. And this Palestinian National National Charter, or National Covenant, makes no mention of Palestinian sovereignty, makes no mention of a Palestinian state, doesn't even assert the independence of the PLO, because it wasn't independent. It was a tool of Nasser's and his pan-Arab policy. But the Six-Day War set in motion a change in this. As I said, there were a few Palestinian nationalists, and there was a small group of them led by Yasser Arafat, exiles living in Kuwait, and they had formed a group called Fatah. It was not part of the PLO, but over the next years, 68, 69, it moved into the PLO and took it over and began to transform the PLO into a vehicle for Palestinian nationalism. And then, in following on that, began in various ways to agitate to put the cause of Palestinian nationalism on the international agenda and to put the Palestinian movement also in the news and on the map through dramatic acts of airplane hijacking and other kinds of terrorism. In addition, in the war, Israel ended up in occupying the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, where several million Palestinian Arabs lived. And so that suddenly there was a putative Palestinian nation, and Israel was an occupier. So this had the effect of transforming the image of the conflict. Until then, there was the vast group of Arabs and tiny Israel. After 67, the image was refocused in a narrower lens to be Israel, which was still tiny but seemed rather formidable militarily, and the even tinier and weaker Palestinians. So Israel sort of went from being the underdog to being the overdog, so to speak. But also with that, until this point, it was clear enough that the conflict was about people, that is the Arabs, trying to deny to the Jews a state of their own, and now it became the Jews trying to deny to some other people a state of their own. So these were very powerful factors in changing the image of the conflict after 1967. But this is still not sufficient, in fact, not nearly sufficient, to explain the tremendous animus toward Israel, which prevails today in the what's called the international community. After all, it may be that Israel became an occupier, and it may be that Israel was denying to the Palestinians the fulfillment of their national aspirations. But by and large, there are other cases in the world of occupation and of frustrated or stymied national aspirations, and by and large, nobody cares about it. That is, when was the last time you saw angry demonstrators against the occupation of Tibet? The occupation of Tibet is far longer standing and far more brutal than any occupation to which the Palestinians are subjected, and also far more unprovoked, and the world doesn't care a whit. And as for frustrated national aspirations, we need only think about the Kurds. The national aspirations of the Kurds are in many ways much more powerful in their legitimacy than those of the Palestinians. I'm not saying the Palestinian aspirations aren't legitimate, but the Kurds are a people many times more numerous. We don't have exact census figures, but the Kurds are probably 5, 6, or more times more numerous than the Palestinians. The Palestinians do have other Arab states which are not very, in their area, which are not very culturally different from the Palestinians themselves, but there's no other state for the Kurds. The Kurds have an ancient history, languages of their own, a well-developed culture of their own, and no state of their own, and more or less no one in the world, except for the Kurds themselves, gives a darn about it. So the rage we see directed at Israel cannot be explained by the simple fact of occupation or the frustrated national ambitions of the Palestinians. And the inconsistency here echoes throughout all of the global campaign against Israel. We see British teacher unions adopting resolutions calling for academic boycotts of Israeli universities. But these same teacher unions have never boycotted or proposed boycotting universities in countries which have no academic freedom and no teacher unions or labor unions of any kind. We've seen the Presbyterian Church in the United States and other denominations pass resolutions for divestment from companies that do certain business with Israel. But these same denominations have never moved to divest from companies that do business in or with countries that deny religious freedom and persecute Christians. There is, in short, widespread inconsistency in the world's approach to this problem as compared to other problems. And there seems to be a predetermination which entails a complete lack of interest in the actual facts or events. What exemplified this to me was the actions of Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt. You have all, I'm sure, read about the Goldstone report that was issued in September 2009 regarding the last war in Gaza of 08-09, a report that actually accused Israel of crimes against humanity, which is a category of crime that was invented for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals, perpetrators of the Holocaust in World War II. And when this Goldstone report, which was later repudiated by Goldstone, but when it was issued in September 2009, the next morning, Carl Bildt, the Swedish foreign minister, speaking not only for Sweden, but at that moment Sweden held the presidency of the European Union, so speaking for the whole European Union, endorsed the Goldstone report the next morning. Now, I know you've all read about the Goldstone report. Have any of you actually read the Goldstone report? You know, it's my burden to bear, since I set out to write a book like this, to have read it. It's 400 pages long of small type. Had Carl Bildt read it by the next morning? Of course he hadn't read it. He hadn't read a summary of it. He doesn't intend to read. It didn't matter to him what was in the darn report. It called Israel guilty, and that was enough for him, formally in the name of all of Europe, to endorse the report. How could this be? It could be because somehow, in the perception, Israel is, by definition, in the wrong. It's the bad guy. And that's all you need to know. You don't need to actually look at the facts. So why is that? What is it that brought about this way of looking at things in which Israel, which once was widely admired, and indeed deserves to be even more admired today for its accomplishments in its 66 years of statehood. One of the great challenges and frustrations that the world has faced since World War II is what sometimes is called nation building. World War II was the turning point after which colonialism was dismantled. And we went from a world of a small number, relatively small number of countries. There were, I think, 50 odd members originally of the United Nations. Today there are 193. Went from a world of a small number of countries to a very large number by the end of colonialism and the birth of some more than 100 new countries. And these countries struggle. They struggle with poverty and they struggle with governance. And the finest example that we have in the modern world of nation building, of a state born after World War II and maintaining democracy and providing a good life for its people, is Israel. That's the reality. And yet, this wonderful success story is widely reviled. So, what are the key factors behind this? When I studied, I ended up grouping the forces that I found to be at work into two categories. On the one hand, there were raw material pressures that were brought to bear to change people's minds, particularly to change the minds of governments. And then on the other hand, there was also a large intellectual shift going on in the world that was not specific to Israel and the Arabs, but had profound consequences for how the Arab-Israel conflict was seen. In terms of what I call raw material pressures, there were three. The first was intimidation by terrorism. In the 1970s, the Palestinian groups undertook a wave of terror attacks in the skies and especially across Europe. This involved airplane hijackings, bombings, sometimes machine gunning, particularly when some would-be hijackers couldn't get on a plane. They sometimes just turned their guns on the waiting room nearby, or what have you. But this terrorism, some, you might say, it made the Arabs or the Palestinians look bad, and it did, but it also had the successful effect of evoking a kind of appeasement response among Europeans and also among moderate Arabs. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Among Europeans, what we saw was that time and again, the perpetrators of these attacks were taken into custody. Sometimes there were shootouts, some were killed, but by and large, in many cases, they were taken into custody, brought into the criminal justice system of European countries, and then released. They were released because the Europeans were afraid to hold them. Because if they were holding these terrorists in their jails, then they feared, for good reason, that the comrades of the ones in jails would stage a new hijacking or terrorist attack to secure their release. Someone did a count late in the 1970s and found that of 204 individuals who had been taken into custody in the performance of a terrorist act, 201 had been released. And what worked to intimidate Europe also worked to intimidate the moderate Arabs. As I said, it was in 1974 that the PLO was declared the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. And it was declared that at a summit of the Arab League held in Rabat, Morocco in 74. And Yasser Arafat's chief deputy, Abu Iyad, later published his memoirs with a French journalist working with him. They published them in French and English. And you can read in Abu Iyad's memoirs that he said, we were able to get this resolution through because the Rabat summit proceeded in his words, climate of terror that he boasts of having created. So one factor was terror, and then the intimidation that was exercised through terrorism was redoubled through the Arab oil embargo that occurred during the 1973 war, and that really brought Europe and Japan, who are more dependent, or at least Europe now has, some countries are big oil producers, but that was not true at the time. And so they're even more dependent than the United States on Middle Eastern oil. And you could read at that time direct statements from European leaders saying quite plainly, we're dependent on their oil, we have to change our stance toward the Middle East to be less offensive to the Arabs. And a year later, Secretary of State Kissinger, who felt strongly that it was a threat and an unacceptable situation to the West to have this sword of Damocles hanging over it, that at any time the oil producers could undertake another embargo, set for himself the task of trying to rally the Western nations for some kind of counter policy. It wasn't clear what that counter policy would be, but some kind of leverage or threats that could be put into play collectively by the West to tell the oil producers, if you do this again, we'll do something to you. We also have a sort of Damocles. And so he made a tour of European capitals, and he wrote in his memoirs of his utter frustration in that tour, which led to nothing. He said, and I quote, "Every minister I consulted was still terrified of possible confrontation with the oil producers," close quote. So there was terrorism, there was oil, and the third material factor is the sheer weight of numbers. For every Jew in the world, there are 100 Muslims. There's one state of Israel, there are 22 member states of the Arab League, there are 57 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And that disparity weighs very heavily in the scales of economics and diplomacy, weighs on governments. And among other things, it has enabled the Arabs to take over the United Nations and use it as a kind of battering ram against Israel. Now, in the United Nations, in the Security Council, the United States exercises a veto. But in every other UN body, it's majority rule. And the way the UN works, it is dominated by something called the non-aligned coalition of third world states. The UN, as I said, has 193 members. 120 of them are members of the non-aligned movement, which is active in the UN. In fact, that's its #1 arena of activity and dominates the UN. But of those 120 members of the non-aligned movement, 57 are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which therefore can always dictate the policies of the non-aligned movement on things that are felt to affect the Islamic world. And at the core of that are the 22 Arab League member states. So there's a kind of telescoping leverage here by which the Arabs completely control the UN. And therefore, a huge proportion of the time of one UN body after another is devoted to passing resolution after resolution after resolution, excoriating Israel for everything under the sun. In addition, they've also used this automatic majority to create 3 special bodies of the UN, 2 committees and 1 bureau. A bureau meaning offices with a staff of dozens of people and a budget of tens of millions of dollars a year. That these 2 committees and bureau are devoted exclusively to the propagation of the Palestinian cause and the denigration of Israel. It's where a lot of the meetings and financing and energy goes into the so-called BDS movement. It comes from your tax dollars and mine through the United Nations Bureau, to which I've referred. Needless to say, there is not a single specialized body of the UN on any other conflict or country or analogous problem anywhere in the world. So, on the one hand, the material pressures, terrorism, oil, the weight of numbers. But there's something else. The material pressures, I think, weigh most heavily on governments. But obviously, it's not just governments that are part of the current global situation of the relegating Israel to a kind of pariah status that is also carried out within the intellectual world, within academia, within the world of entertainment and journalism. And I think to understand that, we need to understand an intellectual shift that, as I said before, was not specific to Israel-Arab issues, but has affected them deeply. And that was a transformation in the latter half of the 20th century in the core idea, the central paradigm of leftist thought. Leftism does not represent, is only one part of the political spectrum. It doesn't represent everyone, but it's the dominant part of the spectrum in the world of journalism, of academia, of entertainment. In the United States, which is the least leftist country, there are more people who identify as conservatives than liberals, but if you look at Harvard or Hollywood or the New York Times, the proportions are dramatically in the other direction. For a century, from the mid-1800s, the core idea of leftist progressive thought was class struggle. It was a passion play, a great moral drama of the poor against the rich, the workers against the capitalists. And this was not just something that was seen as an issue of justice or fair play. This was seen as a drama through which the world would be redeemed. When the workers rose up to do away with the system that had mistreated them and get their fair place under the sun, that would transform the entire world to something more humane and more desirable. That paradigm was replaced in the second half of the 20th century by a new paradigm, which grew out of the anti-colonial movements. And I think in addition to the anti-colonial movements, it was kind of overlaid by the civil rights movement in the United States, which captured the imagination of much of the world. And this was a paradigm of national and ethnic struggle rather than class struggle. It was called by some the rest against the West, or by others the people of color against the white man. And that was seen as the moral drama of our time that would redeem the world. And if you look at the world through that lens, seeing that as being the main moral drama, then in the Israel-Arab conflict, the Israelis are the Westerners, the white guys, the Arabs and Palestinians are the people of color, the anti-colonial forces, and they're naturally, inherently, the good guys. Just as in the old paradigm of Marxism, the workers were inherently the good guys. It didn't really matter what any particular worker did. They had a historic role that was a role of progress and liberation. And that historic role was in this era transferred to the anti-colonial people of color. And this new paradigm was epitomized in the scholarship of the most prominent ever Palestinian American, who was Edward W. Said, professor at Columbia University, whose books are among the most assigned, and have been for decades, on American university campuses. Someone was able, through a Google utility, to do a search. This was a few years ago, I think 2005, 2006. Someone did a search of syllabi that are online and found that there were nearly 900 courses in American universities in which the writings of Edward Said were assigned. In several universities, UCLA, Georgetown, there are entire courses, on the thought of Edward Said. And Cambridge University Press has actually issued a Cambridge Introduction to the Thought of Edward Said. Now, Said's work, it's good to say it here in an academic setting, Said's work amounted to a pure and complete intellectual fraud. I use that word very advisory, a fraud. I'm not saying that he was mistaken or that I disagree with him, but that he was a fraud. And it's not something I would say lightly. Let me explain to you why I say it. Said took something something seemingly obscure and abstract, and used it as the core for this entire worldview that he built up. And what was seemingly obscure was what he called Orientalism. That is, Orientalism meaning the study of the Orient by Western scholars as an academic discipline. And we most, in common talk, we usually when we say Orient, we think of East Asia. But by the Orient, Said meant actually the Muslim world in India. And his thesis, which was kind of the clarion call to this ethnic, national, racial struggle that I spoke about. His thesis was that the white people were all racist. That was the basic idea. And he said in Orientalism, and here is another direct quote, every European, in what he could say about the Orient, was a racist, an imperialist, and almost totally ethnocentric. Every European, he said. And elsewhere in the book he says, what I say about Europeans also applies to Americans. So every European and American who spoke of the Orient was inherently a racist. That was the core idea. And how did he go about proving this? any legitimate scholar would, that wanting to prove a generalization or a hypothesis of that kind, would then gather all of the works of Orientalists, or if all of the works of Orientalists were too many, then gather the works of the 10 or 20 or 30 most influential ones. But Said did not do that. What he did was he ransacked writings looking for quotes that actually were racist or denigrating to Muslims or Oriental people. And then he strung them together and said, you see, every European is a racist. But the problem was that not only wasn't this all of the Orientalists, it wasn't a legitimate sample any which way of Orientalists. Some of the people he quoted and who did say racist things were not Orientalists at all. Others were marginal Orientalists. Some were not marginal, but had also a body of work in which they said contrary things, admiring of the Orient and the Muslim world that he did not quote. So he found the quotes he wanted and then claimed falsely that this was representative of the field. And at the same time, he deliberately omitted from his study Orientalists whose attitude was the opposite of what he was saying was the norm for Orientalists. By the opposite, I mean what was often true for Orientalists, as for, I believe, all area studies academics, people who make a career studying some corner of the world, whether it's China, Japan, Mayan culture, whatever it is, usually the norm among academics is they kind of fall in love with the area that they're studying. That's their life's work. And it turns out to be true for Orientalists too. Most of them were very admiring of what they studied, quite to the contrary of Said. And I'll give you this one example. There was a scholar, a Hungarian Jew named Ignaz Goldziher, who was regarded by many as the founder of Muslim and Arab studies in the West. He was certainly among the very most influential. And his work is not quoted at all by Said, but it will be quoted by me to you, because it will give you a flavor of how profoundly contrary this was to Said's hypothesis. Goldziher, who spent years living in the Middle East, among the Arabs that he was studying, wrote in one place, I quote, "I discovered that Islam was the only religion which can satisfy philosophic minds. My ideal was to elevate Judaism to a similar rational level." Close quote. So there is the real Orientalist, really the diametric opposite of Said's caricature. Nonetheless, Said somehow captured the zeitgeist of this new paradigm of the left that I've described to you. And so he's described for example, by the Guardian newspaper as probably the most influential intellectual of the 20th century. And what Said did in his work was he treated the Muslims as the typical Orientals, and he treated the Arabs as the modal Muslims, and among the Arabs, the Palestinians as the quintessential Arabs. And so by the stages and by a broader cultural trend that Said is the emblem of, we got a transformation of Israel, which had once been seen correctly, in my opinion, as a redemptive refuge for a people that had suffered 2,000 years of persecution. Instead, it came to be seen as an oppressive embodiment of white supremacy. And I think through that intellectual conjuring trick, together with all the material pressures that were brought to bear, we got this complete reversal that I described at the outset, and I started out when I wrote this book to try to understand a complete reversal of the way the world perceives Israel. So that's my story. Thank you for listening patiently. I'd be very happy